Hey guys, welcome to online instruction. Let me just say that I love you and I miss you and I would rather be at school. But since that is not the case, we will continue on in Unit 9, which is basically World War I and the Spanish-American War, which we've already covered. And so today's set of notes will be looking at Woodrow Wilson and the Great War, which is what World War I was called before there was a World War II. And so don't forget that you need to jot down some notes and then send me a picture of your notes so that I know that you have received this very important content. So here we go, let's begin. Okay, so we talked about one of the things that got Woodrow Wilson elected in the first place was the fact that he had moral appeal. And you don't really see that a lot with politicians. So one of the reasons that he was elected in 1912 is one, because the Republican Party split between Taft and Roosevelt, but also he had this sincerity and sense of lots of ethics about him. And so this drew the public to him. He was idealistic, sometimes even blindly optimistic, as we'll talk about in a second, in his dealings with Mexico. And he was also anti-imperialist. So he was not in favor of expanding territory. He would not have been in favor of gaining Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, because he was not in favor of imperialism. And so he, on every level, opposed aggressive foreign policy. One other thing that he did was he denounced dollar diplomacy. This was Taft's method of intervening in other nations' economies. So like we loan money to China, and then we can forcibly intervene when they don't pay us back. And Woodrow Wilson was opposed to dollar diplomacy because he perceived that as obnoxious. So in some instances, he was driven by this idealism. And one of the ways that you see this in his foreign policy is that he persuaded Congress to repeal the Panama Canal Tolls Act of 1912. He persuaded them to repeal it in 1914. And what this did was it allowed for American ships to pass through the Panama Canal without having to pay tolls. So basically we were given special privileges to travel across the Panama Canal, and he did away with this special privilege. He also, when political turmoil broke out in Haiti in 1915, he sent Marines there specifically to help the Americans who were living there, to protect American lives and American property for Americans living in Haiti at the time. And then he actually signed a treaty in 1916 that allowed for the United States to supervise the finances and the policing in Haiti. Another thing that's not in the PowerPoint, but he also signed the Jones Act of 1916, and this one was directed at the Philippines. And basically, he said that once the Philippines had a stable government, he would make them a territory, giving them territorial status, and also he promised independence, which did not happen right away. Okay, so this is actually a contradiction on Wilson's part, keeping in mind that he denounced dollar diplomacy as obnoxious because it was American intervention into another nation's affairs. But this is exactly what he does when he intervenes in Mexico's affairs. I will say, to be fair, initially he wanted the Mexicans to intervene on their own behalf, but when it became apparent that that wasn't going to happen, he sent the American military to intervene in this revolution. And so basically what happens is the Mexican president, Francisco Madero, was murdered and replaced by General Victoriano Huerta. And so this military dictator seizes power. He had several brutal policies, and he was so bad And he caused so much chaos in Mexico that millions of immigrants, many of who did not even speak English, they were just desperate to get across the border. Millions of these immigrants went from Mexico to the United States. And so Wilson intervenes. He personally hated this Mexican dictator, Victoriano Huerta. And so this leads him to send the American military to intervene in Mexico's affairs. That's not staggered. Oh well. So there was a small party of American sailors who were accidentally captured by Mexicans who didn't realize who they were, which was called the Tampico incident. And so Wilson, because of that, ordered the Navy to seize the Mexican port of Veracruz. And so at this point, Wilson has fully intervened in Mexican affairs. And furthermore, he demands that Victoriano Huerta hold free elections. And he said, Huerta, if you don't hold free elections, then the United States will continue to be a mediator in your civil war. Huerta continues to be awful. And so he is replaced by General Carrizana after the U.S. military takes over Mexico City and forces Huerta to abdicate. And so Carrizana was better. He was in favor of a representative government, and he was going to cooperate with Woodrow Wilson. Unfortunately, because he was not an effective leader, he was overthrown by one of his own generals, Pancho Villa. And this is another example of Wilson's blind optimism, because Pancho Villa promises that he will cooperate with the United States and Woodrow Wilson. But it turns out that he was only a bandit, and he was only concerned with gaining personal power. And he's actually so terrible that he and his men ended up stopping a train in northern Mexico, which had Americans on it, and in cold blood just killed 16 Americans. And so this forced Woodrow Wilson to withdraw from Mexico and withdraw from Mexican affairs. So Wilson realizes that U.S. intervention in Mexico has not been successful, and Pancho Villa killed these Americans, and so he eventually withdraws from Mexican affairs altogether. Okay, so shortly after this, World War I breaks out in Europe. And you know about World War I probably from previous history courses. I don't know if you remember Tom Ritchie's main causes of World War I: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. We're not going to go through all of that in this course because we're basically looking at how the United States specifically is involved and how they deal with this conflict. So we're not covering World War I in general. It's more or less how the United States was impacted by World War I and then U.S. involvement when we got involved in 1917. And so we know that the event that started this war was the assassination of the Austrian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand. And so he was the heir to the Austrian throne. And we know that Austrian was a very diverse empire, and there were a lot of people living within that empire who did not want to be a part of that empire. And so as a result, a Serbian nationalist, a member of the Black Hand, hoping that he would free the Bosnians from the Austrian Empire, assassinated the Archduke and his wife while they were visiting Sarajevo. And so because of the alliances in Europe, this thing escalated in like 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, virtually all of Europe was drawn into this massive conflict. When war broke out in Europe, most of U.S. citizens opposed going to war at all. And there was still kind of a fear of being involved in European affairs. If you remember Washington's farewell address, where he said, don't get involved in entangling alliances. And even Jefferson had this mentality of we need to kind of keep to ourselves. And so that provided the justification for our neutrality early on. However, as time went on, we began to trade more with the Allies. And so this led the United States to increasingly favor the Allies, even though we were not involved in the war yet. Most Americans were actually anti-German from the start, though. They viewed Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the leader of Germany, as just the most arrogant autocrat ever. And so because they really didn't like him, there really weren't a whole lot of people in favor of Germany to begin with, unless, of course, they were like German immigrants or Austrian immigrants, or something like that. So the Lusitania, this was a passenger liner. This was a British passenger liner that was sunk by a German U-boat, and there were 128 Americans on board that were killed when this happened. This is not the event that caused the United States to get involved in World War I, but this did turn American opinion definitely against the Germans and more in favor with the Allies, even though people generally preferred the Allies to the Central Powers anyway. And so initially the Germans were very apologetic about what happened to Americans on the Lusitania. And they apologized. They actually agreed to pay an indemnity. Unfortunately, in a year later, they sunk the Sussex as well, which provoked another strong American protest. And this caused the Germans to pledge the Sussex Pledge, which said that they would stop sinking merchant ships without warning, which I find very interesting. They still might bomb them, just not without warning. Okay, so election time again in 1916, and our candidates are President incumbent Woodrow Wilson, who was the Democratic candidate. Interestingly, progressives asked Theodore Roosevelt to run again for president, but he didn't because he didn't want to split the Republican Party again. And so the Republicans nominated a guy named Charles Evans Hughes, and he was a Supreme Court justice. So Wilson, in order to gain the edge in this election, he wanted to appeal to progressives. We've talked about the progressive movement in the previous unit, but in order to appeal to the progressives, he signed the Farm Loan Act, which would allow farmers to have low-cost loans. So he's appealing to the poor Southern farmer. And he also approved the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, which barred goods that were manufactured by children under 16. And then in addition to that, workman's comp, he signed a workman's comp package for federal employees and even modified his stance on the tariff, which caused Republicans to not like him. He was in favor of a tariff. And so he, in order to appeal to the moderates and to the progressives, he took these actions so that he could be re-elected. So because Woodrow Wilson is able to keep Americans neutral during World War I, and because he successfully appeals to progressive domestic policies, he wins a narrow victory over Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. So the United States, as you know, eventually becomes involved in World War I. Initially, Wilson sends his advisor, Colonel Edward M. House, to negotiate with the belligerents of World War I. And so this is an attempt to end the war by mediation, and he actually sends his advisors to London, Paris, and Berlin. And of course, this is not a success. So America moves closer at this point to intervening in World War I. So we finally joined this war, number one, because Germany announced that they would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They renounced the Sussex Pledge and said that they were going to target all ships headed for Allied ports. Well, surprise, we had ships going to Allied ports because we were selling them supplies and weapons. They had 100 or so U-boats, and their goal was to starve the British into submission. And really, they were hoping to try to finish off the Allies before the United States got involved, which did not happen. So the Zimmerman Note, this was released in March, after which Wilson authorizes the arming of American merchantmen. And so this was a letter sent from the German ambassador to Mexico, and he was promising Mexico basically that they would give back Texas if Mexico would fight against the U.S. in World War I. And so shortly after this, this happens in March 1917. So like less than a month later, April 2nd, 1917, Wilson requests that Congress declare war, and they actually do so on April 6th when the Senate votes 82-6 and the House votes 373-50 in favor of war. And so now the United States had a huge task at hand, and that is to mobilize the economy for war. And so we had a conscription bill, which is basically the draft to gain soldiers for war. We set up a war industries board to gear all industry toward war mobilization. So factories were switched over from producing things like pillows to producing things like soldier uniforms. Herbert Hoover, who will later be elected as president, mobilizes the food supplies, and he is actually able to keep us from having to go to rationing by being creative. And so in order to conserve food, he had like wheatless Mondays where people wouldn't eat wheat on Monday, or meatless Tuesdays where they wouldn't eat meat on Tuesday. Boy Scouts showed their patriotism by planting vegetable gardens. Restaurants, this is so gross, added rabbit meat and horse meat to conserve meat. And so that's gross. But Herbert Hoover was able to prevent us from having to go to a rationing system like Germany did by doing that. And so this begins a new era of cooperation between the government and businesses. Because of wartime government planning and because of regulation, this creates a relationship between government and business. So workers in war. The demands of the wartime economy, coupled with the shortage of labor, actually improves circumstances for laborers. Because workers were in high demand, they could demand higher wages. They could demand better working conditions. Immigration, for the most part, reduces dramatically during this time. Wages rise, unemployment virtually disappears. There's this migration of blacks who leave the South, hoping to find jobs in northern factories, which had greater appeal than, sharecropping. And so that's pretty much all for today, and I will stop talking now because this has gotten really long. I love you guys. I miss you. Don't forget to take notes and send me a picture.